The entire galaxy turned its back on them, then humanity stepped forward. The vote was already over before the last delegate finished speaking. I knew at the moment Ambassador Chirix walked into the chamber. He moved slowly, all four of his arms pressed flat against his chest in the Dravari gesture of surrender, not to an enemy, but to fate. He had done this before, I realized. He had already accepted what was coming. He was here only because protocol required it. I was sitting in the observers' gallery above the main floor of the Galactic Conclave, a place where junior human representatives were permitted to watch but not speak. My name is Kale Marin. I was 34 years old. I had been stationed at Nexus Station for 11 months, and I had spent most of those months trying to understand how 47 civilizations could share a building and still have nothing in common. That day, I was beginning to understand. The conclave chamber was enormous. It curved upward in a great dome of pale crystal, and the light inside it shifted slowly between colors that had no human names. Every delegate species had its own section, shaped to fit their bodies, their gravity preferences, their atmospheric needs. The Torati sat in pressurized tanks of pale green fluid. The Archon hovered in a cluster near the ceiling, their wings folded tight. The Velen, tall and silver-skinned, stood perfectly still in two neat rows. And at the center of it all, on a raised platform barely large enough for one figure, Ambassador Chirix stood alone. He was presenting the case for his people. I had read the briefing documents 3 times. I knew the numbers by heart. 3 billion Dravari. A homeworld cracked along one entire hemisphere by a weapon the Veth Horde had deployed 11 days ago. 6 million refugees packed into colony ships with nowhere to go. Food supplies on those ships calculated to last 19 days. The terraforming weapon was still running. Every hour it operated, another portion of Dravara Prime became permanently uninhabitable. Chirix spoke for 12 minutes. His translator unit rendered his clicks and low tones into the common speech that all conclave members used. His words were precise and careful. He did not beg. He explained. He outlined. He presented a formal request for collective intervention under the Conclave's Emergency Solidarity Charter, a document that 43 of the 47 member species had signed. When he finished, the chamber was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then the voting began. The first abstention came from the Torati delegate, a slow, heavy creature whose translated voice always sounded like someone reading a grocery list. He cited resource constraints. His fleet, he explained, was already committed to patrol routes along the outer rim. Diverting ships would create gaps. Gaps were a liability. The Conclave would understand. The Conclave apparently understood, because no one objected. The second abstention came from the Velen. Their reason was the non-interference doctrine, a principle that, as far as I had ever been able to determine, meant that the Velen preferred not to be involved in anything that might inconvenience them. They expressed sympathy for the Dravari situation. They hoped for a peaceful resolution. They abstained. One by one, the votes came in. Abstention. Abstention. Opposed. Abstention. The Archon cited a treaty with the Veth Horde that technically prevented military action. The Keshri cited internal elections that made any foreign commitment politically difficult. The Muresh simply said nothing and pressed the abstain button. Abstention after abstention filled the board on the chamber wall like a long row of closed doors. I sat in the observer's gallery and watched a civilization get abandoned in real time. I had a notepad on my knee, standard issue, meant for taking diplomatic notes. I had stopped writing 20 minutes ago. There was nothing to write. There was only the slow accumulation of cowardice dressed in procedural language, and I was running out of room to hold it inside my chest. Director Yun Harlow, Earth's senior representative, was seated on the floor below. I could not see her face from where I sat, only the back of her head and the rigid set of her shoulders. She was the best diplomat humanity had sent to the Conclave. She had spent 30 years learning how to be patient, how to listen, how to find middle ground. She had also spent 30 years watching species with far more power than Earth choose the comfortable path again and again. The vote total began to settle. 43 abstentions. 3 opposed. 1 in favor. Earth. A single yes, from the newest and smallest member of the Conclave, a species that had only had faster-than-light travel for 60 years. A species that most of the room still thought of as promising but juvenile. Sentimental, the Archon sometimes called us. It was not meant as a compliment. One vote was not enough. The Emergency Solidarity Charter required a 2/3 majority. The motion failed. Ambassador Chirrut stood very still at the center of the chamber. Then, slowly, he pressed all 4 arms tighter against his chest. Tighter than before. The gesture changed slightly, shifted into something the briefing documents described as accepted defeat, not the surrender to fate I had seen earlier, but something final. Something that had moved past hope entirely. I have thought about that moment many times since then. I have tried to identify the exact second when something shifted inside me. I think it was when Chirrut lowered his head, and the chamber's shifting light fell across him, and not a single delegate in that room moved or spoke or did anything at all. 43 civilizations, some of them thousands of years old. Some of them with fleets that could cross a star system in hours. All of them sitting perfectly still while 3 billion people waited on a cracking world. I picked up my notepad. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I wrote 3 words and underlined them twice. What can we do? Not a question. A starting point. I filed a request for an emergency private audience with Director Harlow before I had even stood up from my seat. I sent it through the official channel, flagged urgent, and added a secondary message through our internal system that said only, "I need 5 minutes. Please." She approved it within 30 seconds. I took the long way out of the gallery, down the curved corridor that ran behind the observer level, past the narrow windows that looked out into open space. Nexus Station hung in the void between 3 solar systems, equidistant from each, deliberately placed so that no single species could claim it as their territory. It was a remarkable piece of engineering. It was also, I had come to realize, a remarkable piece of theater. A place where civilizations came to appear cooperative without being required to actually cooperate. Outside the window, stars burned cold and silent. I thought about 6 million Dravarian colony ships. I thought about 19 days of food. I thought about a terraforming weapon that no one was going to stop. I walked faster. Director Harlow was waiting for me in a small conference room 2 levels below the main chamber. She was standing when I came in, which told me she had not planned to stay long. She was a woman in her late 50s, with short gray hair and the kind of eyes that had seen enough disappointment to stop being surprised by it but had not yet learned to stop caring. She looked at me. I looked at her. "Tell me we have options," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled out a chair, sat down, and gestured for me to do the same. "Close the door first," she said. I closed it. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at them for a second, then looked at me. "We have one option," she said. "It is not a good option in terms of diplomacy. It is not a safe option in terms of our standing here. It will almost certainly cause a significant problem with the conclave. And it is the only thing I can think of that has any chance of actually helping those people." I waited. "We never signed the non-intervention compact," she said. "We joined the conclave as observers with full voting rights, but we never ratified that particular agreement. The legal team checked it this morning. There is no rule that prevents us from acting. There is no rule supporting us, either. But there is no rule against it." I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief. Not yet. Something closer to the first breath after holding it too long. "The ships," I said. She nodded. 17 vessels. Everything with a working drive. I made some calls this morning. Before the vote. She had made the calls before the vote. She had already known how it was going to end. "They are going to formally warn us," I said. "The conclave?" "Yes," she said. "Probably twice. And we are going." She looked at me for a long moment. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did. "Commander Marin," she said, "go get your crew ready." I stood up. I picked up my notepad from the table where I had set it. I looked at the 3 words I had written and underlined. Then I walked out of the room and did not look back. The conclave's formal warning reached us while we were still in dock. I was standing on the bridge of the UES Unbowed when the message came through, transmitted on the official diplomatic frequency with all the correct authorization codes and the particular tone that galactic institutions use when they want to sound disappointed rather than angry. The tone said, "We expected better from you." The words said, "Earth is hereby advised that any unilateral military action in the Dravara system will be considered a violation of conclave principles and may result in a review of Earth's observer membership." I forwarded it to Director Harlow. She sent back 2 words, "Already noted." I set the message aside and looked at my crew. The Unbowed was a carrier-class vessel, the largest ship in Earth's Defense Directorate fleet, which meant it was large by human standards and medium-sized by galactic ones. Its bridge was wide and low-ceilinged, lined with stations that always smelled faintly of coffee and machine oil because the ventilation system on Deck 3 had never been fully fixed. I had served on this ship for 4 years. I knew every sound it made. My chief engineer, a woman named Claire Osei, was at her station in the lower bay, already running pre-jump diagnostics. She had been awake for 31 hours. I knew this because she had told me, in a flat and factual tone, when I came aboard, the way she always delivered information she thought you needed to have regardless of whether you wanted it. My lead navigator, a man named Owen Fitch, was at the helm console with 3 star charts open at once and a mug of something he claimed was tea but smelled like nothing found in nature. He was 26 years old, the youngest senior navigator in the directorate, and he had a habit of humming quietly when he was running calculations that he did not hum when he was worried. He was not humming. My weapons officer was a woman named Nora Adeyemi. She had been with the directorate for 9 years, had served on 4 different ships, and had the particular kind of calm that comes not from the absence of fear but from long practice at setting it aside and doing the work anyway. She was running system checks on our defense grid with the same expression she used for everything, which was focused and quiet and gave almost nothing away. 16 other ships were preparing to jump alongside us. I knew their captains. Some of them I had trained with. One of them, Captain Dennis Hale of the destroyer Fenwick, had served under Director Harlow herself 20 years ago and still sent her handwritten letters on paper, which she kept in a drawer she pretended not to be sentimental about. We were not a military fleet. The Defense Directorate was not, technically, a military organization. Our ships were not, technically, warships. These technical distinctions had been very important to certain politicians on Earth for a very long time. Standing on the bridge of the Unbowed, looking at the star chart centered on the Dravara system, I found I had very little interest in technical distinctions. I opened a channel to the Dravari diplomatic frequency. It was not an authorized channel. It was not logged through conclave systems. It was a direct line, arranged quietly through a communications officer who had been very understanding when I explained what I needed. Ambassador Chirix answered after a long pause. His voice came through as a series of low tones that the translator rendered into words, but the words always arrived half a second behind the sound, and for a moment all I heard was the tone itself, low, very low, the kind of frequency that you feel more than hear. "Commander Marin," his translated voice said. "Why are you contacting me on this frequency?" "Because I wanted to tell you something before we left," I said. Another pause. "The conclave has made its decision." "Yes," I said. "We disagree with it." The silence stretched long enough that I thought the connection had dropped. "Then, why?" "There is nothing to gain from this. The political cost to your people will be significant. Your fleet is small. The Veth have 3 dreadnoughts in the Dravara system. The mathematics do not favor you." I looked out through the bridge viewport at the stars beyond Nexus Station. I thought about how to say what I wanted to say. I had a habit of over-explaining things, Director Harlow had told me once. I tried to fight it. "Ambassador," I said, "there doesn't have to be something to gain. There just has to be something that's wrong." The silence this time was different. Shorter. Heavier. "I do not understand your species," Chirix said at last. His translator gave the words a strange quality, something between confusion and something else I could not name. "Most people don't," I said. "We're working on it." I closed the channel. I turned to Owen Fitch. "Navigator, plot the jump." He pulled up the coordinates. His hands moved quickly across the console. He was still not humming. "Jump plotted," he said. "Ready on your mark." I took one breath. Outside, Nexus Station's lights moved slowly past the viewport as the Unbowed finished its undocking sequence. Somewhere behind us, 16 other ships were doing the same. 17 vessels. No dreadnoughts. No heavy rail cannons. Nothing that the Veth Horde would look at and feel threatened by. What we had was Claire Osei, who had not slept in 31 hours and would not stop until the job was done. Owen Fitch, who plotted jump trajectories with a precision that the Directorate's training manual did not fully account for. Nora Adeyemi, who would run her weapon systems with cold and careful hands no matter what came at us. And 260 other crew members across 17 ships, none of whom had been ordered to come, all of whom had come anyway. The Conclave sent its second warning as we cleared the station's docking perimeter. I did not read it. I handed it to my communications officer, a young man named Patrick Cole, and told him to file it with the first one. He did. His hands were shaking slightly. He noticed me noticing and straightened in his chair. "Ready, sir," he said. "Thank you, Patrick." I looked at the star chart. I looked at the mark that indicated Dravara. I thought about 19 days of food. I thought about Chirix pressing his forearms against his chest. I thought about what it meant to be the kind of species that shows up. "Jump," I said. The stars vanished. We came out of the jump and the Dravara system hit us all at once. I had seen combat footage before. I had run simulations. Nothing prepares you for the real thing, not because the real thing is louder or faster, but because the real thing has weight. Real consequences pressed against the glass of the bridge viewport and demanded to be looked at directly. Dravara Prime filled the lower half of the view. It should have been a deep amber color. I had seen the pre-siege photographs in the briefing files, a warm world of vast plains and rust-colored seas. What I saw instead was a planet wearing a wound. One entire hemisphere had gone dark and cracked, split along fault lines that the terraforming weapon had torn open over 11 days of continuous operation. Columns of dark material rose high into the upper atmosphere. The cloud cover on the undamaged side swirled in patterns that were wrong, disrupted by the enormous energy the weapon was still releasing from orbit. The weapon itself was not visible. But its source was. 3 Veth dreadnoughts hung in high orbit, enormous and angular, built in the way the Veth built all their ships, like blades. Long, narrow, with surfaces that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. They were arranged in a loose triangle around the planet, positioned for maximum coverage and minimum interference with one another. Whoever had arranged that formation knew what they were doing. Their first transmission came within 12 seconds of our arrival. The translator ran it through and offered me the result, "Mockery of the presumptuous." That was the exact phrase. Mockery of the presumptuous. I had never been called presumptuous by an alien civilization before. I decided I could live with it. "Nora," I said, "talk to me." 3 dreadnoughts, Nora Adeyemi said, her voice even. Each one is roughly 6 times our mass. Their weapon systems are charging. They detected our jump signature the moment we arrived. The terraforming weapon is still running on the second dreadnought. The other 2 are repositioning to intercept. How long before they have firing solutions? 4 minutes. Maybe 5 if we move. Owen Fitch was already moving his hands across the helm console. "I have a dispersal pattern ready. If we spread the fleet across 3 approach vectors, they cannot cover all of us with their primary weapons simultaneously. They will have to choose. Can they cover 2 out of 3? "Yes," he said. "But not all 3. I thought for exactly 2 seconds. "Signal the fleet. Split into 3 groups as Owen has it. Group 1 is with us on Vector Alpha. Groups 2 and 3 take Beta and Gamma. The objective is not to destroy those ships." I paused to make sure everyone on the bridge heard the next part clearly. The objective is to make the terraforming weapon too expensive to keep running. We disrupt their operation. We make it cost more than it's worth. We give those colony ships time to find somewhere to go. No one asked whether that was possible. They were professionals. They understood that possible was not always the threshold question. The fleet split. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not elegant. I want to be honest about that. Accounts of space battles in fiction tend toward the clean and the dramatic, clear moments of decision and clear outcomes. The reality was confusion and noise and the constant, grinding work of staying functional under pressure. The Veth dreadnoughts were fast for their size. Faster than our simulations had predicted. They adjusted to our dispersal within 90 seconds, and for a while it seemed as though our vector split had simply given them 3 targets instead of one large one. The Ipswich, one of our lighter escort ships, took a direct hit from a Veth energy lance in the first 5 minutes and lost her port drive. Captain Gwen Calloway kept the Ipswich in the fight anyway, maneuvering on a single drive with a control precision that should not have been possible and running interference between the second dreadnought and the rest of Group 3. Claire Osei's voice came up from engineering on the internal channel every few minutes, steady and informative, telling me what the ship could take and what it could not. She did not editorialize. She gave me facts and let me make decisions. I have worked with engineers who panicked under fire, who disappeared into their own fear and left the bridge without the information it needed. Claire was the opposite of that. She was a fixed point. The second group, led by the destroyer Fenwick, reached the terraforming weapons deployment range after 18 minutes. Dennis Hale pushed the Fenwick hard, driving it into the firing arc of the nearest dreadnought in order to draw its attention away from the 2 smaller ships behind him. The tactic worked. The dreadnought focused its secondary weapons on the Fenwick, which was fast enough and well handled enough to avoid the worst of it, while the 2 smaller ships got close enough to the terraforming weapons power relay to deploy electromagnetic disruptor drones. The weapon flickered. It did not stop. But it flickered. I saw it on the sensor readout, a 2-second interruption in the energy output, followed by a restart. 2 seconds was nothing in practical terms. But it meant the weapon could be disrupted. That mattered. What happened next was the part one have thought about more than any other part of that day. The destroyer Fenwick was carrying a crew of 81 people. Dennis Hale had pushed it into the dreadnought's firing arc to buy time for the disruptor run, and the dreadnought had eventually noticed what was happening behind it and shifted its primary weapon to address the actual threat. The Fenwick took a hit to its main drive housing. The ship began to lose structural cohesion in the rear section. It was not catastrophic, not immediately, but the Fenwick was no longer capable of controlled flight in the conventional sense. What it was capable of, as Dennis Hale immediately recognized, was one precisely calculated intercept trajectory. He used the remaining momentum and the ship's maneuvering thrusters to steer the Fenwick into a controlled collision with the dreadnought's secondary weapon array. Not a desperate act. A calculated one. The Fenwick's hull was tough enough to survive the impact, barely, and the collision destroyed the dreadnought's secondary weapons completely, taking it from a fully operational warship to something that could only use its primary lance. Dennis Hale and his crew of 81 survived. Every one of them. The Fenwick was a wreck, but it was a wreck with people still breathing inside it. The dreadnought was effectively halved in fighting capacity. 2 things happened after that. The first dreadnought, which had been targeting Group 1, recalculated. I could see it in the way it moved, a slight withdrawal, a repositioning that was not aggressive. The Veth were not used to opponents who did things that defied their tactical models. They were used to opponents who, when outmatched, did the mathematically rational thing and retreated. We were not retreating. I opened the fleet-wide channel. My voice was steady. I am genuinely not sure how. Keep pressure on Vector Gamma. Nora, coordinate with the Kessler on secondary targeting. Owen, I need us closer to that weapon relay. How close can we get without entering the primary lance range? If we approach from below the plane, Owen said, we can get within disruptor range and stay outside their optimal firing window. Probably. Probably, I repeated. The margin is uncomfortable, he said. Use it. He used it. We spent 11 more minutes running what I can only describe as a complicated argument, conducted at high velocity and long range, about whether 17 human ships were going to keep operating in this system regardless of what the Veth preferred. The second dreadnought shifted to address us directly. Its energy lance fired twice and missed both times, the second time close enough that the sensor array registered the heat discharge. Patrick Cole, at the communications station, did not flinch. He kept every channel open and kept relaying information to the fleet with a calm that I knew, from the set of his jaw, was costing him something. Then the terraforming weapon cut out. Not a flicker. A full stop. The energy signature dropped to 0 and stayed there. I stared at the sensor readout for 2 full seconds, waiting for it to restart. It did not restart. I later learned that a 3-ship team from Group 2 had reached the weapon's primary power relay during the chaos of the second dreadnought's repositioning and managed to physically attach a shutdown device, a piece of engineering that Claire Osei had designed and built during the jump, using components from the unbowed secondary power management system. She had done this in less than 8 hours. She had not mentioned it beforehand because, as she explained afterward, she had not been sure it would work and did not want to raise expectations. The first dreadnought began to withdraw. Not fast. Deliberate. The way something withdraws when it has decided the cost is too high, not when it has been forced to run. The third dreadnought held position. I opened the general communication channel, all frequencies, including the VETH ones. I spoke slowly and clearly. You are going to have to remove every one of us from this system to continue what you are doing here. We will keep coming back. We will keep disrupting your operations. We will keep making this cost more than it is worth. That is not a threat. That is simply what we are going to do, because that is who we are. The third dreadnought was still for a long time. Then it began to move. Slowly at first, then with purpose. Following the first 2 out of the system. No final transmission. No acknowledgement. Just the gradual reduction of 3 enormous ships from close-range threats to distant sensor contacts to nothing at all. The bridge was very quiet. I looked at the sensor readout. I looked at Dravara Prime, its cracked hemisphere still dark and damaged, but its wound no longer being made worse. I looked at the colony ship signatures on the long-range scan, 6 million people, still waiting, but now waiting in a system that was no longer under active attack. Nora Adeyemi exhaled slowly. Owen Fitch set down his mug. Claire's voice came up from engineering, brief and factual as always. Drive systems nominal, she said. Hull integrity at 82%. We are functional. I sat back in the command chair. My hands, which had been resting on the armrests, felt very heavy. Thank you, I said. To all of them, to no one in particular. Thank you. Patrick Cole, at the communications station, looked up from his console. His hands had stopped shaking. We had not won. I was clear-eyed about that. The VETH had not been defeated, they had been inconvenienced. They would recalculate and return with more ships and different plans unless something changed at a level far above what 17 human ships could affect. But the weapon was off. The planet was no longer being torn apart. And 6 million people in orbit had another day to figure out what came next. That was what we had. It was enough to work with. I looked at the cracked planet below and thought, we bought you time. Use it. 3 weeks later, I sat in a virtual courtroom. That is not the official term for it. The Galactic Conclave called it an emergency inquiry into unilateral action, which is a longer phrase meaning the same thing. I was present as a holographic projection, beamed from the Unbowed's communication suite to the chamber at Nexus Station, where 47 species were assembled once again, this time to discuss what humanity had done. The inquiry had begun at 9 in the morning by station time. It was now past 4 in the afternoon. I had been answering questions for most of that time. The questions were not unreasonable, taken individually. Did Earth act without Conclave authorization? Yes. Did Earth's fleet engage in activities that could be construed as military action against a third party? Yes. Did Commander Marin personally communicate with Ambassador Chirix through an unofficial channel prior to departure? Yes. Was Earth aware that such actions could affect its standing in the Conclave? Yes. The Torati delegate had asked that last question with the air of someone presenting an irrefutable argument. As though being aware of consequences and choosing to act anyway was evidence of wrongdoing rather than a description of almost every meaningful decision a person ever makes. I answered every question honestly. I did not embellish or deflect. I had been advised by Director Harlow to be precise and factual and not to editorialize, and I had agreed to follow that advice, and I was following it. What I said was, yes, we did those things. No, I do not regret them. Yes, I understand the political consequences. I understand them clearly and I believe they are worth it. The Arkan representative asked me to explain my reasoning for that belief. I was quiet for a moment. Not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to give the real answer and not a diplomatic version of it. 6 million Dravari were in colony ships with 19 days of food when we jumped into their system, I said. The terraforming weapon had been running for 11 days. Every hour it ran, more of their world became permanently uninhabitable. The conclave voted and declined to act. We looked at those facts and made a decision. The decision was that 3 billion lives were more important than our political standing. The chamber was quiet. That is a subjective value judgment, the Velen delegate said. She was standing very straight, the way the Velen always stood, but something about her posture was slightly different from 3 weeks ago. Slightly less certain. Yes, I said. It is. It cannot serve as the basis for galactic policy. I am not proposing it as galactic policy, I said. I am explaining why I gave the order I gave. I am not asking the conclave to agree with me. I am being honest about my reasoning because you asked for it. Another silence. Then something happened that I had not expected. Ambassador Chirix activated his channel. He had been present throughout the inquiry, in observer status, because the Dravari were still technically a non-voting member of the conclave. He had not spoken. He had sat at his designated position in the chamber for 7 hours and said nothing, his forearms resting at his sides, his compound eyes unreadable. When he spoke, the chamber went still in a different way from the stillness I had experienced during the vote 3 weeks ago. That stillness had been indifference. This one was something else. Something closer to attention. Chirix did not speak for long. He spoke for 4 minutes. He described the last 3 days of the siege from the surface of Dravara Prime, where he had been when our ships arrived. He described the sound of the terraforming weapon, felt through the ground rather than heard through the air, a constant low vibration that the Dravari had lived with for 11 days like a slow earthquake that would not stop. He described the colony ships in orbit, visible at night as moving points of light, and what it meant to look at those lights and know they had nowhere to go. He described the moment their sensors registered 17 human ships dropping out of jump. He said the ships were too small. He said even the people who saw the sensor data did not believe, at first, that those ships were there to help, because help was a thing the conclave had just formally refused to provide, and it seemed impossible that it would arrive through another door so quickly. Then he said something that I have thought about many times since. They came, he said. We had been told that no one would come. We had been told the mathematics did not support it. We had been told the political cost was too high and the military advantage too small. And then they came anyway. And I want the conclave to understand something. The question of whether their action was legally authorized is a real question and it should be examined. But there is another question that this chamber should also sit with. It is this: when the vote was taken and the answer was no, which of us can honestly say that we are glad they listened? The chamber was very still. I watched the delegates through my holographic feed. I watched the Velen representative's hands, which were folded in front of her, and which tightened slightly at Chirix's last words. I watched the Torati delegate in his pressurized tank, motionless. I watched the Archon, hovering near the ceiling, their wings completely still for the first time in 7 hours. No one spoke for almost 30 seconds. The inquiry did not end with an exoneration. I had not expected one. What it ended with was a procedural suspension, a formal decision to postpone any ruling on Earth's conduct indefinitely, citing the need for further review of the relevant legal frameworks. In galactic diplomatic terms, this was the institutional equivalent of a long and uncomfortable silence. It was not approval. It was also not condemnation. It was 47 civilizations sitting with something that did not fit neatly into their existing categories. That night, back on the Unbowed, I sat in the small observation room off the main corridor on Deck 2, looking out at the stars. Claire Osei found me there about an hour after I had come in. She sat down across from me without asking, which was characteristic. The inquiry, she said. It was not quite a question. Suspended, I said. Indefinitely. She nodded slowly. Do you think they will come back to it? Probably, I said. Politics doesn't forget. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, do you think we will be expelled from the conclave? I looked at the stars. I thought about Chirix's words. I thought about the Velen delegate's hands. I don't know, I said. She looked at me directly. Would it have mattered? Would we have not gone? I didn't answer. She didn't push it. She already knew the answer, and so did I. She got up after a while and went back to engineering, because there was always something that needed doing, and Claire was constitutionally incapable of leaving something undone. I stayed in the observation room a while longer. What I kept returning to was not the inquiry itself but a small thing that had happened in its final minutes, after Chirix had spoken and the chamber had gone still. One of the Keshri delegates, a species I had almost no direct experience with, quiet and careful, known for staying out of conflicts that did not directly involve them, had turned to look at the human delegation's position in the chamber. Not at Director Harlow. Not at the legal team. At the empty observer seat in the gallery above, the seat I would normally have occupied if I had been there in person rather than as a projection. The Keshri delegate had looked at that empty seat for a long moment. Then he had looked away and said nothing. I thought about that look for a long time. It did not feel like judgment. It felt like reconsideration. Something had shifted in that chamber. I could not measure it or prove it or file it in a report. But I had spent 11 months learning to read a room full of alien species, and I was certain of it. Something had shifted. A year passed. It passed the way years do when you are busy enough not to notice them properly, in pieces, in tasks, in the slow accumulation of smaller moments that only reveal a pattern when you look backward. I was back on Earth for 3 weeks in the spring, the first extended leave I had taken since before Dravara. I spent most of it at my sister's house in the northwest, walking in forests that were very green and very quiet and asked nothing of me. My sister Lena made food and did not ask many questions, which is one of her great gifts as a person. I slept for 10 hours a night and felt guilty about it until I stopped feeling guilty about it. When I came back to Nexus Station, things were different. Not loudly different. Not in ways you could point to in a briefing document. But the texture of the place had changed. The way delegates moved through the shared corridors. The way conversations paused when human staff walked past, not with the previous slight dismissal, these are the new ones, the junior ones, the sentimental ones, but with something that took me a while to identify correctly. It was attention. We were being paid attention to. The official news, when it came through proper channels, was small and procedural. The conclave had revised its emergency solidarity charter. The revision was buried in a section of secondary protocols, written in the dense legal language that galactic institutions use when they want to change something without appearing to. But the legal team had found it, and Director Harlow had read it, and she had sent me the relevant passage with no comment except a single line below it. They changed it. What they had changed was the threshold for emergency intervention. It now included a provision, narrow, carefully worded, easy to miss, that allowed member states acting in the preservation of sentient life to proceed without a 2/3 majority if the primary vote failed and evidence of ongoing harm met a specific standard. The standard was high. The provision would not be easy to invoke. But it existed. It had not existed before Dravara. No one had announced the change. No delegate had stood up and said, "We were wrong, and we are correcting it." It had simply appeared in the revised charter, passed in a procedural session attended by a fraction of the full membership, and filed into the record. That was how galactic institutions admitted error. Quietly. In the footnotes. I thought about Chirix's words in the inquiry chamber. I thought about the Velen delegate's hands. I thought about the Keshri delegate looking at the empty observer seat. 7 separate species had contacted the Earth diplomatic mission in the past year through back channels, unofficial frequencies, and quiet meetings in corridors not covered by the station's recording systems. None of them had said anything officially. What they had said, in various ways, through various translators, adding up to roughly the same thing regardless of species, they had been ashamed. They had forgotten something. They were watching us now. The Arkan emissary, who met with Director Harlow over a meal in a private suite on the station's upper level, had spent most of the meeting being indirect. The Arkan were rarely direct. But at the end, just as she was preparing to leave, she had said something that Harlow relayed to me word for word. "Your species does something that the older civilizations stopped doing," the emissary had said. "You act as though your choices matter. Most of us stopped believing that a long time ago. It is a belief that is difficult to maintain across centuries. But when you lose it, you lose something that cannot be recovered by policy or by protocol. Perhaps you cannot understand how unusual you appear to us. Or perhaps that is exactly why you appear that way. Then she had left. And Director Harlow had sat with that for a while before writing it down. I received a physical package at the station 3 months after the inquiry. It was marked with Dravari shipping codes and had been cleared through standard customs with no particular flag. Inside was a sealed metal container about the size of a large cup, with a pressure seal and a label in Dravari script that the station's translation system rendered as something that lived through it. Chirix had included a handwritten note on a flat piece of Dravari material that served the same purpose paper served for humans. The note said, in translation, from a region of Dravara Prime that the weapon did not reach. The healing there is slow, but it is happening. We thought you should have some of it. I kept the container on the small shelf above my bunk on the unbowed, next to a photograph of my sister and a broken compass that I kept for reasons I had never fully explained to anyone. Every morning when I woke up, I saw it. The situation on Dravara Prime itself was slow and difficult and not resolved by what we had done. The Veth Horde had not returned to the system, but intelligence indicated they were still active in several other regions of space. The Dravari were rebuilding, but the damage to their world was severe and the process would take decades, not years. 6 million refugees had eventually been distributed to 3 separate colony worlds under agreements that Chirix and his diplomatic team had negotiated with help from a coalition of conclave members, not a formal intervention, but a quiet and sustained effort from several species who, for reasons they did not publicly explain, had become more willing to be involved. The Velen had contributed 3 medical ships to the refugee distribution effort. They had not announced this, either. It had simply happened. I thought about what the Arkan emissary had said. You act as though your choices matter. I turned that over in my mind during the long quiet hours of transit jumps, during the late watches when the bridge was dim and the station was hours away. I was not sure it was a uniquely human quality. I was not sure it was something we had invented or something we had simply not yet had enough time to lose. 60 years of faster-than-light travel. 11 months at Nexus Station. One decision in a courtroom that was not quite a courtroom, to walk out and make the call and go. Maybe the older species were right that the belief was hard to maintain across centuries. Maybe it wore down over time under the weight of all the votes and all the abstentions and all the carefully worded doctrines of non-interference. Maybe there was something about being young and new that made it easier to act as though it mattered, because you had not yet had enough time to talk yourself out of it. I did not know. I was not a philosopher. I was a commander with a crew of 260 people and a ship that needed its port ventilation fixed and a new mission brief sitting in my inbox. The mission was a humanitarian convoy route. A stretch of space between 2 contested regions where 3 small colony worlds had been cut off from regular supply lines by a territorial dispute between 2 non-conclave species. The route was not dangerous in the way Dravara had been dangerous. It was dangerous in the quieter way of uncertainty. We did not know who we might encounter or how they would respond to a human presence. Director Harlow had asked me personally if I wanted the assignment. I had said yes before she finished the sentence. Now I was back on the Unbouts Bridge, looking at the route plotted on Owen Fitch's NAV console, a long curving line through empty space with 3 small dots at the end of it representing 3 worlds full of people who needed things that had not been reaching them. Owen was humming. He had been humming since we received the mission brief. It was a quiet sound, almost below hearing, and it meant he was running calculations he felt good about. Nora Adeyemi was at the weapons station, not because she expected to need to use it, but because she was always at the weapons station. It was where she worked best. Claire Osei was in engineering, probably already 2 steps ahead of whatever problem the mission would present, probably already building something useful with spare components. Patrick Cole was at communications, young and steady, his hands no longer shaking. I looked at the route. I looked at the 3 small dots. I thought about what it costs to show up. Not just in the moments of high crisis, with dreadnoughts on your sensors and a planet below being torn apart. In the quieter moments too. The convoy runs. The long transits. The missions that do not make history but fill in the spaces between history with the slow and unglamorous work of actually being present for people who needed someone to be there. The galaxy had a lot of those spaces. The Conclave, for all its centuries and its 47 species and its crystal dome with the shifting light, spent most of its energy managing the spaces between crises rather than addressing the crises themselves. That was not cynicism. That was the reality of governing at scale. You could not intervene everywhere. You could not fix everything. Resources were real, logistics were real, political will was a limited commodity. But you could also not simply agree to be the kind of civilization that watched from a gallery and took notes and filed requests and flew home when the vote went the wrong way. The conclave was not wrong that we had acted without authorization. The conclave was not wrong that it created complications. The conclave was also not wrong that precedents have consequences, and that a galaxy governed by individual moral conviction rather than collective agreement would be chaotic and difficult. All of those things were true. And also, the weapon had stopped. The people were alive. Both things could be true. I had stopped trying to resolve the tension between them. The tension was real and it was not going away, and living with real tensions honestly seemed better than resolving them falsely in either direction. I looked at the Dravari container on the shelf above my station. Something that lived through it. I thought about Chirix, pressing his arms to his chest in that great chamber, accepting something that should never have had to be accepted. I thought about him looking at his sensor board and seeing 17 ships that should not have been there, coming anyway. I thought about what he had said in the inquiry. They came. 2 words. Translated through a machine that always introduced some small error. But not those words. Those words had come through clean. Owen Fitch stopped humming. He looked up at me. "Ready when you are," he said. I looked at the route. I looked at the 3 small dots. I looked at my crew. They called us sentimental, like it was a flaw. I flew a ship named the Unbowed into uncomfortable odds for people I had never met, and I slept just fine. Maybe that was the only kind of sentimental that mattered. The kind that got in the ship anyway. "Take us out," I said. The Unbowed moved. The station fell behind. The stars opened up ahead. We went.